Hello and welcome to The Bull. My name's Lester Kiewit.
And I'm Tara Roos.
And we're here to talk about politics, parliament and Tara's hot takes. How you been, Tara?
I'm unwell, but it's okay.
Okay, it's just the weather. Let's get into the show. Today with the topic of politics, Tara, we're going to be discussing how geopolitics is affecting local politics, local trade, the local economy, but also local households. Of course, I'm talking about from the 1st of August 2025, the United States under Donald Trump is imposing a 30% blanket tariff on all South African exports to the US, but not only that, 50% tariffs on steel and aluminium, 25% tariffs on automotive parts, but there's also possibly even a 10% additional BRICS penalty targeting countries aligned with BRICS and the BRICS bloc. This is going to impact the South African economy, with the Reserve Bank governor says expect 100,000 jobs to go.
I think South Africans, particularly in the agricultural sector, are going to be placed in a very difficult position. This is largely going to affect the citrus market. And when you look at the current US-South Africa dynamics, where the US is opening up to Afrikaner refugees, more specifically farmers in particular, how this is going to affect that dynamic of this idea that there is this white genocide in South Africa. Now we are imposing tariffs. So Ramaphosa has come out really strongly against Donald Trump to say that there is no genocide and that he thinks that these tariffs are completely unfounded. What I thought was so interesting was that we found out about this as a South African public via Truth Social. Donald Trump posted the letter on Truth Social, and when Cyril Ramaphosa's spokesperson was asked about whether or not they had received the letter, they said that no official letter had been sent to the president, and they had to find out with the rest of the South African public via Truth Social. And I just thought that was absolutely laughable.
To coin a phrase that's used by the youth, the US-South Africa dynamic, the relationship has been more like a situationship.
God.
That's what the kids say. It's been a situationship over the last while, particularly around trade. Look, South Africa is part of the AGOA agreement. Initially, South Africa, and the AGOA agreement gives South Africa and other African countries preferential access to sell to the US market duty-free. South Africa originally wasn't intended to be part of an AGOA agreement. Was supposed to be intended for emerging African markets. South Africa is an African economic powerhouse, and initially the United States is no. You guys already have a mature market. You're not included in AGOA. South Africa managed to convince the US, well, so many of African countries' goods come through our ports of entry and then go up into Africa, that we have to be included. So there's always been a tension between the United States and South Africa, whether it be under Donald Trump, Joe Biden, even Barack Obama, when it comes to the issue of trade.
I think when looking at the fallout of AGOA, this has been a long time coming. AGOA was up for renewal. I think that in the president's mind and in many of the cabinet ministers' minds, AGOA was not going to be renewed. Controversial opinion, I don't think that AGOA ending is a bad thing for South Africa. If anything, even when looking at the current tariffs, I think that this is going to negatively impact the United States a lot more than it will South Africa. Look, a lot of people are throwing facts and figures around, but I think it's really important to contextualize it. Yes, automotive exports will be down by 80%, but our largest automotive exporter partner is the EU, not the United States. South Africa has other options. I don't think that I could say the same thing for the US, specifically when you were looking at Donald Trump's almost like worldwide domination persona that he's trying to put on, where he's placing tariffs on people left, right, and center. He is isolating the US rather to a point where they have no allies. I think that South Africa has a lot of other opportunities that we could venture out into. Will it be as lucrative as AGOA and as having the United States as a primary trading partner? No. However, do we constantly want to be and find ourselves in this hostage-like situation where the US is constantly dictating to South Africa what we can and can't do, where the US is almost putting out this narrative of who we are as a nation. I mean, I think it's almost really similar to the dynamic within the GNU currently, where you have these two people constantly fighting at each other. Like, you are going to find no resolve if you have one party trying to dictate to another how they think the relationship should go, and rather than have it being mutual. I mean, like, even studies are coming out now saying that even when we lose a go in with the tariffs, it will only drop our GDP by 0.06%. I think that South Africa, in the long run, is going to be okay.
We also have to realize we're not special here.
Yeah.
This isn't a specified targeting. Yes, there may be advantage taken in terms of our circumstance here, but we're not special. 20% tariffs for Japan and South Korea, key US partners, 35% tariff on Canada, 50% tariff for Brazil. And this is because Donald Trump wants his COVID buddy, Jair Bolsonaro, to be allowed back into politics. He wants the Brazilian court system to drop charges against Jair Bolsonaro. It wants him to be allowed to run for re-election. Lula da Silva, the current president, says no. South Africa is not special, but that does not mean that tariffs would have an impact on South African markets and South African households.
And I think, look, the US is a world power. I think that is undeniable. But when looking at the manner in which Donald Trump specifically is going around looking at diplomatic trade relations, I think isolating the US is also not a good idea, because they are a world superpower, if you will. But you are only there on the backs of other nations. Unfortunately, in this geopolitical era and geopolitical age, the US cannot have this kind of like top-down approach and just think that every other country in the world will fall in line. Because, I mean, specifically when you look at South Africa, I think that our best bet is expanding the African Free Trade Agreement. I think that inter-African trade, imports and exports, will be really beneficial to the South African economy and to other African countries who are facing these tariffs. I think that there are other options. But when you limit the US's options to only who Donald Trump sees as their allies, it will place the US economy in a very precarious situation.
So what is South Africa doing? Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Park Stow, he has to lead a South African effort to try and craft a bilateral trade agreement to stave off a 30% tariff on South African goods. But what will that entail? Everything from purchasing gas from the US to allowing South African car parts, maybe even allowing a case where American pork gets dumped onto South African markets. And I know that the South African pork producers and farmers, they're not happy about that, but it's about crafting some sort of bilateral agreement that we hope both the US and South Africans could find benefit in.
I don't think that we will have a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement developed until internally, specifically the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, their internal issues, but specifically within the GNU, are sorted out. I think that the Democratic Alliance and the ANC have two very different views on how to handle US-South Africa relations. I mean, even when you look at the Democratic Alliance's statement on our special envoy to the US, when you look at the manner in which I think international relations for both the ANC and the DA is a point of contention. And I think that this specifically, they're not on the same page on how to deal with this and until we rather get on the same page, I don't think that we will see any movement happen in that direction. What I would be really interested to see is that if this is a point or one of the many reasons the DA would add their list to potentially leave the GNU, because what it is looking like, we need to have a comprehensive response by the 1st of August when these tariffs hit. And I don't think that the ANC and the DA are in discussions yet to get on the same page about what we will do by August 1st. And I mean, I don't think it's a main reason why they would potentially leave. I'm of the opinion that I think that they are waiting to be kicked out. But I do think how the DA plays this in the media rather as yet another strike against the ANC's name of something that they are not talking to their GNU partners about.
Well, but if the Democratic Alliance and John Steenhuisen in particular says, well, they're here in the GNU to help stabilize and save South Africa, he has been quite vocal in finding some sort of, from the agricultural sector, he is the Minister of Agriculture, from the agricultural sector, trying to steer the SA agricultural industry into less choppy waters, looking at diversifying our markets.
Yeah.
We have already started selling plenty of avocados to China. So from that aspect, from what I hear in the tone and substance from a John Steenhuisen, agriculture minister, in trying to find a resolution here, and not necessarily hearing much about tariffs and geopolitics being one of the reasons why the DA could leave a GNU.
I think for the DA, look, and it's this dichotomy, is that John Steenhuisen is both the leader of this opposition party inside the current government, but he's also the Minister of Agriculture. And even if you look, it's very contradicting what the DA is putting out about what they internally think about US-South African relations and what their ministers are then doing in the government. And I think when looking at that contrast, I mean, I don't think it's a reason that they would leave, but I think it would be really interesting to see how the media narrative plays out for the Democratic Alliance coming out. Almost, will they blame the ANC for these tariffs? Will they look at what the government is currently doing and criticize, as they've done with many other policies in the past? Will there be any points of contention? I do think that is likely.
We've paid a lot of attention to what the DA is doing, but what is the Freedom Front Plus doing, who is a member of the GNU? Its former leader, Pieter Groenewald, is Minister of Correctional Services in the Cyril Ramaphosa cabinet. Freedom Front Plus and other Afrikaner and agricultural organizations have been in Washington also to push their particular narrative. Shouldn't there be any calls to a Freedom Front Plus and a Corne Mulder and a Pieter Groenewald by Cyril Ramaphosa saying, hey, you're part of this government, why are you going to speak to the United States on your own accord?
I think specifically when we're looking at the Freedom Front Plus, I don't think that the reason why the ANC has buckled down on them as hard as with the DA is because they don't have as much pull within the GNU. I mean, we all say that the smaller parties are there just to hold up appearances to make it look like it is a GNU, but it is really just a coalition between the ANC and the DA. I do think for the Freedom Front Plus, I don't see a scenario in which, unless something really intensely happens, that they leave. They would never leave the GNU over this. I think when looking specifically, I mean, they also had made a really big sing-song about Bella, and that also died down. I remember when the DA and the Freedom Front Plus had that big march in the Union buildings in Pretoria to kind of like fight for Afrikaans as a language. And I mean, that was a media moment here today, gone tomorrow. And I think that is what a lot of these comms exercises are. And I think that it does confuse the South African public about what is a real point of contention and what they're just pushing to the media in order to get screen time.
Okay, let's move to Parliament now, and what has been discussed firstly, after we taped last week's episode at the weekend, the President had his announcement putting the police minister on special leave, instituting a commission of inquiry looking into the allegations of Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi. But then also, this week, Kumbutso Ntshavheni, the minister in the presidency, briefed the media on South Africa's national security strategy. And she essentially confirmed that a coup d'etat is a risk in South Africa. It's the first real public admission by this government and Cyril Ramaphosa's administration and the preceding ANC administrations that a democratic government is under threat. But what I want to know is, if Kumbutso Ntshavheni has said we've identified the threat and we've managed to mitigate against the threat, the weather doesn't cause a coup. People do. So if you've identified a threat, mitigated against a threat, surely then you should have the hawk saying we have made arrests on people who we believe have been planning or colluding to overthrow a democratically elected government.
I think the minister was correct in saying we've identified that there are reasons for a coup to be possible in South Africa. I mean, when you look commonly around the world, why coups happen, it's because of financial insecurity in the country, political instability. When we look at the lack of service delivery, when we look at growing inequality, all those factors are relevant and present in South Africa currently. However, it is my personal belief, I don't think a coup is ever going to happen. I think even the minister, the way in which she had phrased it, I sat in that briefing, and the way she had phrased it and how she had almost like tiptoed around what she had said, I don't think that the Hawks have made any arrests. I think by the government saying, we have identified, is maybe them just acknowledging it for the first time, because it's...
Well, that's acknowledging that 14 million South Africans go hungry at night. It's acknowledging that on average 70 people are killed in this country every day. Acknowledging that there are so many systemic developmental issues, which is then the breeding ground for a dissatisfaction in the state. And we look at year in, year out, Afrobarometer surveys get published that says every year it increases. More and more South Africans would rather forego regular elections, would rather forego a constitutional democracy, and would rather appreciate some sort of benevolent dictator or strong man in uniform. If that is what she's describing, then I'm sorry, Minister, we've known that for years.
Yeah, we've known that. And I think while all those things are true, the one thing South Africa does not have is a strong and robust military that is interconnected across the country. More specifically, going from the SANDF to SAPS, we do not have enough armed forces for a coup to be logistically possible in South Africa. I think specifically, even if you look at the disconnect between SAPS, Metro Police, when we look at the SANDF and their base structures, I think that while there is a bleeding ground for a coup, I think that is undeniable. I don't think unless civilian-led, because what the minister had described was a military armed enforcement base that could potentially overthrow the government. I don't think that that is likely at all. If anything, if there were to be a coup, and I don't think that a coup is going to happen, but if anything, I think it would be fully civilian-led.
So coup maybe not, but destabilization, definitely. You block a couple of trucks on the N3 leaving the port of Durban. You block outside or destabilize outside of the port of Richards Bay. That means the economic lifeline of South Africa is cut off. It means the economic lifeline of Southern Africa is cut off. I'm sorry, but that's what we saw in July 2021.
We did. I mean, we saw a miniature version of what had happened, I think just 2 or 3 years ago, where the taxi industry in the Western Cape was fighting with the city of Cape Town. I mean, they had blocked off all those major roads. Like, I think those instances is very realistic, and we could see civil unrest in that matter. To the point that, yes, it could destabilize the government, but overthrow the government? No, I don't think so. And even when you're looking at studies like Afrobarometer saying that a lot of people would rather have a almost Ibrahim Traoré type to have and take over the country, I don't think that that's what the South African public wants. I fight really strongly against this, because a lot of people are like, you know what, I don't vote, I don't care, a dictator can just take over. But I think, look, democracy is an extremely flawed system, but it's the best system that we have. You say all these things until your own civil liberties and rights are taken away. And I mean, there's many things that are wrong with the South African government. We would be the first to say that. But in a dictatorship, could you and I be sitting here talking about those things?
So what I think you're saying is that the South African public and the 70% of 16 to 35-year-olds who agree with the notion of some sort of benevolent dictatorship is too uneducated to know what it actually means.
Yes, 1,000%. And I think that often people, specifically you look at the rise of political parties like the Patriotic Alliance, the National Coloured Congress, and the way they almost operate their political parties within local government structures and in communities. And you often talk to people about the dangers of, because I mean, Gayton McKenzie's openly said he's a dictator.
The Patriotic Alliance is a dictatorship because they have no mechanism for electing a leader. The MK party is a dictatorship because there's nothing in their constitution. Firstly, their constitution says that the leader of the party chooses whoever holds any office. There's no part of the MK constitution that says how you elect a leader. So we already have two political parties who are dictatorships.
And I think dictatorship can be idealized a lot. I think a lot of people bring up examples. They're like, look at how well the UAE is doing. Look at countries like Saudi Arabia. Look at what is now going on in Burkina Faso. Yes and no. I think even in a democracy at large, and I make this critique when people are like, voting changes nothing, but you could never operate on the notion that politicians will always do the right thing. By giving someone unequivocal power with having no mechanisms of repercussions, it's extremely dangerous. And democracy is extremely flawed. Extremely flawed, but it's the best system that we have. And I think my argument, and I come up against this a lot when people are like, oh, voting changes nothing, is that, okay, but not voting also doesn't change anything. So you could sit back and you could have a dictator come in and, completely change the lives of South Africans for the better. But what happens if that individual abuses their power? Because now we have mechanisms to have a motion of no confidence against the president, to remove a minister in a commission of inquiry. There are democratic mechanisms that we can hold the government accountable. Do we as the public always exercise them? No. But in a democracy, and I think that's the beauty of democracy, is that it's flawed, but it's the best system that we have. And I don't think that South African public and the electorate is really educated on why democracy is important, because I think that it is really, and I also think it's really disparaging to the millions of South Africans who fought for a democratic South Africa. I mean, people risk their lives for us to be able to have a say in a free and fair country and for us to stand at the ballot box. And I think that it's extremely disparaging, specifically when hearing these notions come from young South Africans, because all we know is democracy, and you have many elderly South Africans who had lived under the apartheid regime, which quintessentially was a dictatorship, and the way in which it operated specifically for black and coloured South Africans. And I think that it is really irresponsible to want to go back there.
So when the ANC says we've been too good at this democracy thing, that people have so easily forgotten the hard-fought gains, are they correct? When they say that we've electrified X amount of homes in areas where there was no electrification, when we provided water to areas where there's never been water before, when currently a national food nutrition program which feeds 9 million South Africans children every single day. Is the ANC then right when they intimate, well, democracy has been almost too good for South Africans, that we have forgotten just where we have come from?
I think I wouldn't say that democracy has been too good for South Africans, but I think a lot of South Africans actually recognize and sit with what the reality of the apartheid regime was. And you know what? I will be the first person to say the ANC has run this country into the ground. I think specifically as a young South African, 2019 was Cyril's era of renewal. I was there. I was like, I think that he could change the country, and it has been utterly disappointing to see where we are as a nation. But even in my disappointment, I would take a disappointing ANC any day before we ever go back to the National Party and live in a country where we could not sit here and talk about this, where we didn't have any rights. I think specifically as a woman, when you look at the trajectory of countries like Iran, what is happening around the world where women's rights are getting stripped back, specifically in other African countries where we look at things like female genital mutilation on the rise. Like, there are many instances, even with, and the gender-based violence crisis and femicide crisis in this country is harrowing, to say the least. But when you look at the social protections that you still have in this country, we are so much further ahead than where we would have been had democracy not come about in 1994.
Okay, so we've dealt with politics, we've dealt with Parliament. What's Tara's hot take for the week?
I'm so sick and tired of the GNU. I don't want to hear about it anymore. And not to be a DA hater, but they need to stop complaining. Also, this whole thing, I would just like to say this on record now. When are we recording this? What's the date?
Thursday, the 17th of July.
The DA is not going to vote against the budget. They did not go through budget 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, pass the fiscal framework, vote on the division of revenue just for appropriations not to pass. They're going to make a deal with Cyril Ramaphosa, and they're going to institute a new deputy minister. I think, if I look into my crystal ball, I feel like they'll offer it to Matt first, Cuthbert, head of policy for the DA. I think Matt will turn it down, and Mark Burke will be our new man there at Trade Industry and Competition. But I'm tired. John mustn't call another press conference on a Saturday to waste my time when it could have been an email. The next time I want to hear about the DA and this GNU is if they're going to leave. And if they're not going to leave, let's reconvene in 29. I'm tired. There's instability, and I think the country feels it at a certain level to be like, oh, they're here today, they're gone tomorrow. But even internally when you work in politics, I'm tired. Stop talking about this GNU. Either leave or you stay, make a decisive decision, but I don't want to hear about it anymore.
I think that's where we'll leave it. Tara Roos, thanks so much. Pleasure as always. We'll chat to you next week, and we'll chat to you next week. If you have a question to Tara or I on anything politics, parliament, maybe even pop culture, where to get the best kombucha, Tara knows. Drop us a comment in the comment section below. Until next time, have a good one. Cheers.
Bye.